Yeah, no, that's tough. I mean, there's a lot of hype around zone two training, right? And
Yeah.
I get these questions all the time, and I'm like, oh, cool. Well, what's zone two training? And in, people are like, oh, well, it's like this heart rate percentage of your max heart rate. I'm like, great. So how do you figure out your max heart rate? And they're like, oh, a formula. I'm like, yeah, that's not going to work. And then more accurately, that's not going to transfer from exercise to exercise to exercise. You would have a different range for bicycle, for a treadmill, for a rower, for a ski erg, for a stair. Like it's modality specific, right? And so, in fact, probably one of the best resources on this is Joel Friel. He was a senior USA's men's cycling coach, and he talks about using this sort of functional training threshold, where effectively you do a piece all out max intensity. You find what is your max heart rate at this particular modality, and then you can use percentages of that to train in different zones.
That makes sense. Yep.
Yeah, and ideally you would have a blood lactate meter as well to kind of figure out like, okay, here's
we all have those.
So right, exactly. But the point of like zone two would be you're right at that threshold where blood lactate has risen a little bit, but is staying right where it's should be, just right just around 2 or just below that, something like that. And it's only good for a month, and you got to retest and then recalibrate. So in any case, that's all problems with like just defining zone two and like prescribing zone two, right? The next problem would be then, okay, so let's say we have no problems with describing it, finding it, whatever. Well, then is there good data that zone two compared to zone one or zone three or zone four at an equal volume or equal total work done promotes a more favorable health trajectory? Do people have less risk of heart disease or less mortality from heart disease? Do they have a reduced risk of type 2 diabetes? Like, is there some tangible benefit that we have good longitudinal data on? And the answer to that is no. The answer to that is no. So when people are like zone 2 is better, it's like, then what? Then nothing? Yes, agreed.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You could make maybe a tangential or sort of inference sort of argument that zone 2 would be more favorable than zone 1 if you have to make a number of leaps here. There's data looking at people like endurance athletes who spend more time in zone 2 than zone 1 for their moderate intensity conditioning. And then they look at measures of their VO2 max, for example, and the people who spend more time in zone 2 have a higher VO2 max than people who spend more time in zone 1. Okay, so then we have to make the next leap to say, well, look, VO2 max is a good measurement of cardiorespiratory fitness. And we know if there's a dose-dependent relationship between cardiorespiratory fitness and reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, having a higher VO2 max would be likely to improve your health trajectory. But we don't, again, have that longitudinal data. We've made a number of assumptions and inferences to get to that point. So what I would say is that, yes, moderate intensity conditioning is useful, full stop. But as far as whether that needs to be zone 2, zone 1.5, zone 1, zone 2, I can't tell you. And again, I think the problem is the prescription. Even with the current exercise guidelines, right? It's like everybody needs to do 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity or moderate to vigorous physical activity, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity activity. And they're like, okay, cool. Well, what's moderate and vigorous? And they're like, we're going to use METs. We're going to use METs to prescribe this. So you need 500 to 1,000 MET minutes of physical activity of conditioning per week. And then it's like, well, the MET, the unit was derived from one dude, a 70-kilo guy sitting in a chair. And now we extrapolate this to the MET compendium. It's like, well, your MET cost for an activity is different than mine, is different than my dad's, is different than my brother's. And so how can we use that? So there's been other studies where they look at like, okay, what heart rate is associated with these different MET costs, energy costs, what RPEs are associated with these different sort of MET costs and intensities. And that's where it kind of ends for me, is prescription. So I'm thinking moderate intensity cardio based on this talk test using RPE. Moderate intensity is like RPE 5 to 6. Vigorous intensity would be RPE 7 and higher. And you can use that to sort of prescribe the intensity. And then as far as the distribution of intensity, we'd be thinking 80% of your conditioning should be from this moderate intensity zone, 20% maybe from the vigorous intensity. And how you mix and match that, if whether it's zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4 for vigorous, I don't know. I think it's more shoulder shrug and speculation. But when people make confident claims about zone 2 is the best, I'm like, you got a reference for that? And you do, and not only one reference, do you have like 20 references? Because you're stating it very confidently. And so we're not trying to practice reference-based medicine where you can find a single study showing a single relationship. What you want to know is, what does the totality of the evidence say? And how does that, fit in with your recommendation here? So when people say a thing and they're like, look, one citation, I'm like, great. So there's 20 other studies on this. What do those other 20 say? And then how does that shape your recommendation. And unfortunately, what happens in this space, particularly with influencers and popular folks, is that it's more reference-based than actual evidence-based. But people in the lay public can't really tease that out, but nor do I expect them to, right? How do you become you don't need to become an expert at reading the research just to like get a recommendation. At least you shouldn't have to anyway.